8. World War II plane wreck. The American-made Vought F-4U Corsair fighter plane entered military service in 1942. The aircraft played a significant role in the Allied victory in World War II. It established a reputation as one of the U.S. military's most formidable fighters and was soon in high demand among other nations, including Britain, France, New Zealand, and Argentina, just to name a few. Nearly 12,600 of the aircraft were produced throughout its 11-year production run. In 1950, two Corsairs collided in mid-air while flying above Lake Washington near Sandpoint Naval Air Station. One of the planes, piloted by Commander Ralph Milson, sank 190 feet or 58 meters to the bottom of the lake. Luckily, Milson survived the crash. Records show that the Corsair was delivered to the Navy in 1945 and served aboard the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid at the tail end of the war. It was stationed at Sandpoint just a few months before the collision over Lake Washington. More than 30 years later, in 1983, the aircraft was recovered from the water. It underwent a full restoration and is on display at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. 7. Ancient ship anchor. While conducting a survey 25 miles or 40 kilometers off the Suffolk, England coast in 2018, employees of an offshore wind farm project discovered an ancient wrought iron anchor buried in 13 feet, 4 meters of sand. The anchor was recovered from the North Sea in 2021, giving experts a chance to examine it up close for the first time. They believe the more than 6.5 foot or 2 meters long, 220-pound or 100-kilogram object dates back to the Roman or Late Iron Age, and are working to confirm its age. If their suspicions prove to be true, it means the artifact could be one of the oldest and largest surviving examples of a Roman anchor. And if that's the case, it could offer new insight on Roman maritime activity in the region, something experts know relatively little about, according to marine archaeologist Brandon Mason, who told the Jerusalem Post that the evidence points toward the anchor being nearly 2,000 years old. He went on to say that there are only 3 known pre-Viking anchors from northern European waters, and only 2 of them survived. In addition to the tests that are being carried out to determine its age, the anchor will undergo conservation work, which is expected to take several years. It's slated to go on permanent display at the Colchester and Ipswich museums in 2025. 6. The Champagne Wreck. Built in Sweden in 1896, the 328-foot-long, or 100 meters, 2-masted schooner Jönköping operated as a cargo ship during the early 20th century. While transporting goods through the Baltic Sea from the Swedish port of Galv to Finland, which was Russian territory at the time, the vessel was stopped by a U-boat. The German crew found railroad supplies on the ship and deemed it to be war material. Consequently, they sank the Jönköping off the Finnish coast. With it, the ship took 17 barrels of wine, 16 bottles of cognac, and 4,400 bottles of 1907 Heidsick champagne, called Goût Américain. The wreck was rediscovered in 1997 at a depth of 210 feet, or 64 meters. Nearby, the team also discovered the wreck of another Swedish ship called the Aegir, which was sunk by the same U-boat as the Jönköping. Divers visited the Jönköping and found it perfectly preserved and in one piece, with little more damage than broken masts and a small hole in the hull from its sinking. They retrieved hundreds of bottles of champagne, which were found in an excellent state of preservation. When the explorers sampled the booze, they found that it was perfectly drinkable and delicious. The team planned a return trip to the Jönköping, but became entangled in a war with a Finnish crew claiming rights to the wreck. While the Swedish team was gone, the Finnish team had salvaged a sizable portion of the champagne, which reportedly sold for as much as $10,000 per bottle. The rest of the cargo was eventually raised along with the ship, but the vessel was deemed too damaged to turn into a museum, and it was sent back to the seafloor. Would you have a glass of champagne recovered from the bottom of the sea? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 5. SSGP Griffith wreck. Nobody knows exactly how many people were aboard the 193-foot-long, or 59 meters, wooden passenger steamer SSGP Griffith when it caught fire off the Ohio coast in 1850. The ship was en route from Buffalo, New York to Toledo when a crew member noticed sparks near the smokestack. Captain Charles Roby began sailing toward land in hopes that the passengers would be able to escape, but the Griffith ran aground on a sandbar about a half-mile, 0.8 kilometers from the Willoughby, Ohio shore. Only 40 people survived. Record-keeping wasn't nearly as detailed back then as it is now, leaving the identities of the hundreds of lost passengers a mystery. Carrie Sowden, who works as a curator at the National Museum of the Great Lakes, told the Toledo Blade that the majority of the passengers were most likely European immigrants who were traveling to various cities after arriving in the U.S. and first heading to Buffalo. She said that most of them probably didn't know how to swim, and that their heavy clothing may have made it even more difficult to stay above water. The sinking of the GP Griffith is widely considered one of Lake Erie's deadliest wrecks of all time. While the ship itself remains at the bottom of the lake, some artifacts have been retrieved by divers. In 2022, the family of a diver who recovered the Griffith's bell in 1974 donated it to the museum, which previously had no artifacts from the vessel in its collection. After spending more than a century in the water, the once polished bell is visibly weathered. Sowden told Toledo Blade reporter David Patch that the museum specifically chose the bell so people can see how the underwater environment affected it. 4. Royal Liquor. In 1917, a Swedish steamer called the Kairos navigated through the Baltic Sea toward Russia with a cargo of luxury goods, including hundreds of bottles of liquor. Some of the items were most likely intended for Tsar Nicholas II, who would end up being executed the following year. But the ship never reached its destination. It was sunk by a German U-boat in a part of the Baltic Sea between Finland and Sweden known as the Sea of Åland. Sweden maintained neutrality throughout World War I, but Germany and Russia were at war, making all foreign ships carrying cargo to Russia a target among the Germans. According to the Kairos' manifest, it was laden with 2 tons of spirits, along with an array of steel and machine parts when it sank. While en route to Russia, the vessel was stopped and searched by a U-boat. The German crew decided to sink it. They transferred the Kairos' crew onto another ship and sent them back to Sweden, then blew the ship up with an explosive charge. A Swedish dive team called Ocean X rediscovered the wreck in 1999 at a depth of 250 feet, or 77 meters. Its location was lost again until recent years. During one of the team's first trips back to the Kairos, they saw that it was covered with fishing nets. To further complicate things, visibility was extremely poor. The team returned to the wreck a third time with remotely operated vehicles, and finally began to pull items to the surface. They recovered around 900 bottles of cognac brandy and Benedictine liquor. Some of the bottles were damaged from the high water pressure at the site, but others were perfectly preserved, owing to the dark and cold conditions they sat in on the seafloor for over a century. Ocean X founder Peter Lindbergh told Live Science that the booze could be worth millions of dollars, and that some of it might still be drinkable. The brand that made the Benedictine is currently owned by Bacardi, but the cognac brand, De Hartmann & Co., no longer exists. Lindbergh suspected that the cognac might be attractive to collectors given its obscurity, and said that he hoped to auction it off. And while he admitted to CNN that he couldn't definitely say that the spirits were meant for royalty, it was definitely at least meant for the nobility surrounding Tsar Nicholas. 3. Atlantic wreck. Built during the late 1840s, the Atlantic was a 266-foot-long, or 81 meters, luxury steamboat and U.S. mail ship that had a reputation for carrying large amounts of valuables due to its upscale clientele. In August of 1852, the ship left Buffalo, New York for Detroit, Michigan, with over 250 passengers aboard, consisting mostly of honeymooning couples and European immigrants. The Atlantic stopped and picked up even more travelers in Erie, Pennsylvania, bringing in its total passenger count to somewhere between 500 and 600. The next morning at around 2:00 a.m., the dangerously overcrowded vessel collided with a steamer called the Ogdensburg in Canadian waters amid heavy fog. While the Ogdensburg was mostly undamaged, the Atlantic quickly began to take on water. Panicked passengers jumped overboard and clung to anything that floated. In the meantime, the Ogdensburg's crew rescued as many people as they could. Somewhere between 150 and 300 passengers drowned, making the Atlantic sinking the 5th deadliest Great Lakes wreck. Numerous artifacts have been recovered over the years. Just a few years after the sinking, a diver salvaged an American Express security box containing $36,000 in cash, the equivalent of around $1.4 million today. Because the ship was rumored to be carrying as much as $60,000 and millions of dollars worth of gold, some believe that there could still be treasure among the wreck. In 1991, a salvage team recovered a collection of items from the Atlantic, including a running light and plates featuring the steamer's name and image. Diver Stephen Morgan told the Buffalo News that they were planning to revisit and hopefully raise the wreck, but the Ontario government claimed rights to it and won the case in court. Since then, it's remained at its resting place 200 feet, 61 meters below the lake's surface. 2. Rare German World War II bomber. Nicknamed the Flying Pencil for its narrow fuselage, the Dornier Do 17 was a twin-engined light bomber used by the German Luftwaffe during World War II. It was designed in the early 1930s and was popular for its ease of handling at low altitudes. The Do 17 was the Luftwaffe's main bomber during the Battle of Britain in 1940, when the Germans attacked British shipping convoys and ports in an effort to corner the UK into a peace agreement. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the British fought back and shot down hundreds of German planes. Most drowned German aircraft were melted down and turned into British aircraft, according to the Royal Air Force Museum, which is why it was surprising when divers discovered a sunken Do 17 in the English Channel in 2008. It's one of the only known intact examples of the aircraft, and was raised from its resting place 50 feet, 15 meters underwater in 2013. Experts said the recovered bomber was in remarkable shape. But like any vehicle that sits in corrosive waters for upwards of 70 years, the condition is fragile. Over the years, staff at the RAF Museum in Cosford have been working to restore and preserve the plane, with plans to eventually put it on display. 1. Ancient canoes. In 2021, maritime archaeologist Tamara Thompson found what she initially thought was a log at the bottom of Lake Mendota in Wisconsin. But she realized that it would be strange for a log to have somehow made its way to the bottom of a lake and gathered some colleagues to take a closer look. They soon realized that the 15-foot log, 4.6 meters object, was a 1,200-year-old dugout canoe, making it the oldest intact boat ever found in Wisconsin at the time. The team recovered it from a depth of 27 feet, 8.2 meters, bringing it into contact with air for the first time since 800 AD. Experts believe the canoe was made by members of the Ho-Chunk Native American tribe. In the absence of modern tools, The builders would have burned a tree trunk and then hollowed it out by hand with stone tools. The process was painstaking and would have taken hundreds of hours and a great deal of skill, according to Wisconsin state archaeologist Jim Skibo. Preservation efforts are underway. In September 2022, Thompson discovered another Ho-Chunk canoe just 300 yards, 274 meters from the first one. After consulting with members of the Ho-Chunk Nation, archaeologists removed it from the lake with plans to preserve it. Radiocarbon dating revealed that the canoe is around 3,000 years old, making it much older than the first one that was found, and possibly the oldest boat ever found in the Great Lakes. To put its age into perspective, archaeologist Amy Roseborough told Whisk News that it predates pottery and farming. Its wood was in delicate shape. Thompson compared it to wet cardboard. And it'll take at least 2 years before either of the canoes are fully preserved. For members of the Ho-Chunk Nation, whose history in the area spans at least 2 ice ages, the discoveries were a meaningful way to connect with their past. The canoes will eventually go on display at a new museum in Madison that the Wisconsin Historical Society plans to open in 2026.
Number 5. The Mediterranean Sky. The Mediterranean Sky has come a long way from her days as a cruise liner to its current resting place in Elefsina, Greece. Although it's one of the most well-known shipwrecks in the country, its appearance has been quite unsettling over the past 20 years. It was created in 1953 by Vickers Shipbuilding and Engineering of Barrow-in-Furness in the UK and was first known as the City of York. It traveled all over the place, from London to the port of Beira in Mozambique, alongside her 3 sister ships, the City of Port Elizabeth, City of Durban, and City of Exeter. It once took the cruise liner only 15 days to travel from London to Cape Town. In 1971, she and her 3 sister ships were purchased by the Greek cruise company called the Karageorgis Lines. This was when the vessel was renamed the Mediterranean Sky, and she was then transformed into a passenger ferry along with the City of Exeter. The 541-foot-long ship offered numerous modern conveniences for the time, including air conditioning, plush accommodations, 2 swimming pools, chic bars, and polished oak decks. It could impressively carry up to 470 cars and roughly 1,000 passengers. Mediterranean Sky was also the first cruise ship to travel the now famous Patras-Venice route. And during its heyday, the wealth and elite people of the 1970s would rent out the ship for winter cruises. In August 1996, she made her final journey from Patras to Brindisi. The ship stayed decommissioned at the former port of Patras as a result of the significant financial difficulties the ship owner experienced between 1996 and February 1999. The Patras Port Authority paid for the ship's relocation to Elefsina in 2002, and on November 26th of that year, the now-abandoned Mediterranean Sky was purposefully beached after being hauled into shallow water. Because of the company's debts, the ship stayed there, utterly deserted. But in January of 2003, Mediterranean Sky tilted gradually before sinking and capsizing. To this day, the partially submerged wreck can be easily seen from the shore. It was decided in 2009 that the ship, as well as 17 other shipwrecks in the Gulf of Elefsina, would finally be removed. However, that never happened, and the vessel's been sitting there rusting in disgrace for the past 18 years. In 2017, the graffiti group known as One Up covered about half of the ship's exposed side with the word One Up. As of 2022, Google Earth can still see the wreckage. The area isn't maintained very well, and there's trash littering the roadside, but visitors may park close to the ship and walk quite a distance to the coast in order to get a better view of the Mediterranean Sky's remains. Number 4. Costa Concordia. On January 13, 2012, the Costa Concordia capsized in extremely shallow water off the coast of an Italian island. Investigators are still trying to figure out why the extravagant cruise liner was sailing so close to the shoreline in the first place. The preventable disaster claimed the lives of 32 passengers and left dozens of others with significant injuries. In the lawsuit that followed, the prosecution offered a story-worthy defense, stating that the married ship captain sailed so near to the island because he wanted to impress a much younger Moldovan dancer that he was having an affair with. However, according to Schettino himself, he'd steered the ship so close to the shore because he wanted to salute passing sailors and also give his passengers a good view. But the Italian courts determined that the captain, 4 crew members, and 1 representative of the ship's corporation, Costa Concordia, were responsible for the accident and delayed a hasty evacuation. A ship malfunction or unpredictable weather were not to blame for the crash. Instead, a chain of human blunders was the only reason for the tragic event. It was originally meant to travel on a 7-day cruise, taking its passengers from Civitavecchia to Savona. The Costa Concordia, however, ran aground on the Skull Rocks Reef after straying from its intended course to approach the island of Giglio. This action put 4,229 people at risk, mostly because the impact allowed water to flow into the vessel. The ship lost power as a result, drifting until it capsized and sank off the coast. At his trial, Captain Schettino blamed crewmember Jacob Bin for the shipwreck, claiming that he misunderstood his instructions and failed to respond quickly enough to prevent the ship from crashing. But according to testimony from an Italian Navy admiral in the court, the accident would have occurred regardless of Jacob's delay in carrying out the captain's orders. The crew started to flee the ship a little over an hour after it ran aground. However, the investigation made note of several passenger statements who claimed not to have heard the alarm that would have signaled them to head toward the lifeboats. The Concordia was listing so heavily to the right that it was nearly impossible to step into the lifeboats, let alone lower them to one side, which only further complicated the evacuation. The crew's improper anchor drop made matters even worse, drastically decreasing their ability to turn the ship. The captain, who was allegedly caught up in the chaos, managed to reach a lifeboat before anybody else. As he was making his escape, a Coast Guard on the phone ordered him to get back on the boat and assist with the rescue of his passengers. Schettino defended himself by saying that because the ship was leaning so far to the right, he fell into the lifeboat. However, his statement was later proven to be false. By the end of his trial in 2015, he was found guilty of manslaughter, abandoning his ship before his crew and passengers were evacuated, as well as lying to authorities. As a result, he received a 16-year prison sentence because they delayed rescue efforts and downplayed the accident by attributing it to a blackout. Jacob Bin and Roberto Ferrarini, the ship's crisis coordinator, were found guilty as well. Number 3. The MS World Discoverer. The stranded wreck of the German-built Liberian cruise liner MS World Discoverer rusts away in an isolated harbor in the Solomon Islands. It was constructed in 1974 and diligently served several owners for over 25 years. But in April of 2000, the ship ran aground on an undiscovered reef formation in the Pacific Ocean. It resulted in a power failure that left the vessel adrift until it crashed and sank off the coast of the Solomon Islands. When it was initially sold to the Danish company Biwa Cruises in 1974, the ship was known as the Biwa Discoverer. In 1976, Adventure Cruises Inc. purchased the vessel, and it was then registered in Singapore. It took the name World Discoverer while it was part of Adventure Cruises. Under this new ownership, she became a long-term charter to the company Society Expeditions. She was then re-registered in Liberia in 1990, and 6 years later she underwent renovations in order to bring her up to date. A recurring schedule guided the MS World Discoverer's operations. Every year from November to February, she traveled throughout the southern hemisphere, stopping in Chile, Argentina, Antarctica, and the Falkland Islands. Between March and May, as well as August to October, she explored the islands of the South Pacific, while June to August were spent in Alaska along the Russian border in the Bering Sea. On average, 2 to 3 shore expeditions were conducted each day by geologists, historians, marine biologists, and naturalists. In addition to a lecture hall and an observation lounge, the ship had a library, a modest fitness facility, a medical center with a practicing doctor, and a sun deck with a built-in swimming pool. On about 4 p.m. on April 30, 2000, the MS World Discoverer encountered an unexpected coral reef while sailing through the Sandfly Passage in the Solomon Islands. The ship was damaged in the collision, which prompted the captain to send a distress signal to Honiara, the country's capital. Everyone on board was saved by a passenger ferry that was sent to the vessel's location. Then, in order to prevent her from entirely submerging, her captain brought her to Roderick Bay and grounded her there. Despite an effort at salvage, the ship was deemed a constructive total loss because of the ongoing civil war. The ship is still there today and has since turned into a sort of tourist attraction. The MS World Discoverer had already been looted by natives during the Solomon Islands Civil War, according to every salvage firm who attempted to recover the ship's valuables. Tidal action has further increased the structure's corrosion and surface rusting. This vessel will likely stay where it's at for a very long time, until it slowly disintegrates into the water. Number 2, the SS United States. The heyday of ocean liners is long gone, and we're now in the age of enormous cruise ships. The RMS Queen Mary and America's flagship, the SS United States, are two immobile ships in the US that serve as relics of a time when transatlantic luxury travel was comparable to that of the Titanic. The RMS Queen Mary is now a hotel and tourist destination in California. However, it's currently closed for restoration. On the Delaware River in Philadelphia, the USS United States rusts away. But the ship is still being preserved in order to rehabilitate it and turn it back into a proud American icon. The SS United States was built between the years of 1950 and 1951, and to this day, it remains the biggest ocean liner ever built solely in the US. She was created for United States lines and now holds the record for crossing the Atlantic in the shortest amount of time in each direction. Ever since her maiden voyage, the USS United States has managed to hold the record for the fastest transatlantic speed. She was originally designed to be able to transform into a troop ship, just in case the Navy ever needed her during the war. However, she managed to operate a continuous transatlantic passenger service up until 1969, never being called into battle. A new age dawned when the SS United States was laid to rest, and by the 1970s, transatlantic passenger aircraft had replaced the older ocean liners. Since then, she's been sold multiple times, with each new owner unable to earn a profit. The RMS Queen Mary II is the only ocean liner still operating today. The bulk of ocean liners have long since been retired, making her the last one still in service worldwide. The SS United States fittings were ultimately auctioned off, and asbestos and other hazardous trash were removed from the vessel. She was fully stripped by 1994, and about 2 years later, she was hauled to Philadelphia's Pier 82, where she's remained abandoned ever since. At number 1, the MV Liubov Orlova. Since January 2013, a Russian cruise ship has been drifting in the North Atlantic after severing its tow rope while being transported from Canada to a Dominican Republic scrapyard. The vessel had been a Maria Yermolova-class cruise ship that was ice-strengthened in Yugoslavia, and it was mostly utilized for trips to the Antarctic. Since the ship is unmanned but still afloat, the MV Liubov Orlova is one of several ghost ships whose current locations are unknown. Leonid Brezhnev, a Soviet leader, commissioned the construction of the Liubov Orlova in 1976 as part of a fleet of 8 sister ships in order to prepare a port in Yugoslavia. The Russian actress Liubov Orlova is the inspiration for the vessel's name. The Far East Shipping Company, which originally had ownership of the Orlova, used it to transport people around the Soviet Union's eastern coast, mostly in the Vladivostok area. The elderly ship, nicknamed Liubov Orlova, was assigned to haul freight in the late 1990s, and she continued to do this for 2 years in a row, transporting second-hand vehicles from Japan. Marine Expeditions chartered the vessel for voyages to the Antarctic Peninsula in 2000 after it had been renovated the year before. However, issues apparently began in 2006, when it had to be towed back to shore after running aground in Antarctica. Every tour lasted 8 to 12 days, and during the off-season, the ship team was responsible for keeping her up to date with repairs. Specialists closely monitored the vessel's technical condition to ensure that passengers cruised safely. In St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland, Liubov Orlova was seized in 2010 after a haulage contractor filed a lawsuit against the owners for $250,000 in unpaid costs. Before being sold to Caribbean purchasers in February of 2012, the ship was anchored for more than 2 years. The vessel was then designated to be towed to a scrapyard in the Dominican Republic because its condition was only getting worse. However, on the trip there, the tow line connecting the tugboat snapped, leaving the ship dangling in the middle of the ocean. Transport Canada deployed the supply ship Atlantic Hawk to secure Liubov Orlova because they were worried about the risk to nearby oil and gas operations. The tug team made several attempts to catch the ship, but none of them were successful. A few days later, on January 27, 2013, the Canadian Coast Guard issued an order to the tug ship's captain, instructing him to throw a liner and return to St. John's due to the sea's dangerous conditions. It was believed that the Liubov Orlova sank after that, but in February of 2013, the U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency discovered a ship 435 miles off the coast of Ireland. The Irish Coast Guard used AIS tracking and radar in order to try and locate the missing vessel, but all of their attempts proved unsuccessful. Apparently, this Russian ghost ship has been seen by a lot of people. In 2014, rumors spread that the Liubov Orlova was slowly traveling in the direction of Britain. Then in 2017, signals that allegedly originated from Liubov Orlova were picked up and recorded from 700 miles off the coast of Cary, Washington. However, in more recent years, there's been no reported sightings of the lost vessel. Number 8. The RMS Republic. The British Royal Mail ship known as the RMS Republic was built in Belfast, United Kingdom in 1903. The vessel was especially popular among the ultra-wealthy, earning it the nickname of the Millionaire's Ship. During the early morning hours on January 24, 1909, the Republic encountered a thick fog off the Nantucket coast. The crew slowed the ship down and constantly blew whistles to alert any nearby vessels of their presence. Despite these safety measures, the Republic collided with a steamship called the SS Florida, killing 7 people between both ships. The Republic's surviving passengers were transferred to the less damaged Florida. Historians often credit the crew's hasty evacuation efforts and their cooperation with one another for the low number of fatalities. The Republic disappeared beneath the surface the following day, making her the largest ship ever to sink at the time. Ever since, rumors have circulated about a stash of treasure and gold coins going down with the Republic. At the time of the sinking, the hoard was supposedly worth somewhere between $250,000 and $3 million. If that's true, then it means that the goods could be worth up to $1 billion today. Treasure hunter Martin Bay-Earl located the wreck in 1981. Then in 1987, he raised $2.5 million from investors to fund an expedition to the vessel in hopes of finding the hoard of valuables. And while his team made some fascinating discoveries, including a room filled with hundreds of bottles of 19th century wine and champagne, they didn't find the treasure. Bay-Earl was subsequently forced to give up the search due to a lack of funding. Naturally, others who were eager to get their hands on the gold petitioned the court for permission to explore the wreck, but a Massachusetts judge ruled that Bay-Earl and his son Grant possessed exclusive rights to the wreckage. It's unclear whether they plan to continue looking for the treasure, and nobody even knows for sure whether it exists. At number 7, the USS Oriskany. Since the development of the aircraft carrier in the years following World War I, the United States Navy has had more of them than any other country. The American military also owns the world's largest modern aircraft carriers. The country's fascination with these massive warships dates back to the 1920s, but the production of U.S. aircraft carriers picked up noticeably throughout World War II. One of the many warships that were built during this period was the 888-foot-long USS Oriskany. It entered service right after the war ended and operated primarily in the Pacific until the 1970s. The Oriskany served both in the Vietnam and the Korean War and was awarded a total of 12 battle stars between both conflicts. In 1966, someone accidentally lit a magnesium flare aboard the ship and a catastrophic fire broke out, ending in the death of 47 crew members. The vessel was retired from service in 1976, and it sat for nearly 20 years before being sold as scrap in 1995. However, the buyer didn't do anything with the deteriorating ship, and it continued to decay with an uncertain future. The Oriskany was repossessed from its owner in 1997 and bounced around between shipyards in California and Texas while the Navy tried to decide what to do with it. They ultimately chose to sink it off the coast of Florida in the Gulf of Mexico as an artificial reef. Then, in 2004, the ship was towed to Pensacola, where Navy scientists performed human health studies and ecological tests to ensure that the Oriskany would pose no dangers to marine life or the environment after being placed on the ocean floor. A Navy team sank the vessel 2 years later in 2006, finally giving it a home after withering away for decades as an unwanted eyesore. Number 6. The Mayflower. In 1620, 132 passengers and crew members boarded a wooden ship called the Mayflower and set sail from England headed for North America. Around 40 of the passengers were Protestant separatists who had broken away from the Church of England and were seeking a new life, free from religious persecution. They called themselves saints, and we know them today as pilgrims. The voyage was difficult, and the Mayflower arrived in America nearly 2 months later than originally planned. The pilgrims began building a settlement called Plymouth Colony in what is now the state of Massachusetts, but they soon realized that they were woefully unprepared for the brutal cold and blizzards they encountered. During that first winter, half of the pilgrims died from exposure, starvation, and disease. Unfortunately, the ground was so frozen they couldn't grow food. They lacked adequate shelter and were forced to live inside the Mayflower, where they suffered from deadly outbreaks of tuberculosis, scurvy, and pneumonia. The settlers also forgot to bring their fishing rods with them because they were so eager to leave. If it weren't for the help they received from Native Americans, it's likely none of the pilgrims would have survived until spring. Indigenous locals taught the newcomers how to gather food and survive in the wilderness, enabling some of them to narrowly avoid death. The Mayflower returned to England the following year. Records suggest that it was last seen in 1624 in the Thames River following the death of its captain Christopher Jones 2 years earlier. It was apparently abandoned and forgotten about in the river until one of the Mayflower's owners applied for an appraisal of the ship in May that same year. Tradition claims that the vessel was dismantled and a barn was built out of its timbers, but this has never been proven, and the Mayflower's fate remains a mystery to this day. At number 5, the RMS Lucitania. The 787-foot-long RMS Lucitania was the world's largest luxury ocean liner when she embarked on her maiden voyage from Queenstown, Ireland to Sandy Hook, New Jersey in 1907. For the next 7 years, she transported thousands of first, second, and third-class passengers back and forth between Europe and North America. The ship's first-class accommodations were top-notch and included a lavish dining room spanning 2 decks, a smoking room, a reading and writing room, an exquisite lounge, and a music area, and more. These high-end spaces boasted carved mahogany panels, gilded wallpaper, imposing Corinthian columns, and other excessively expensive decor. Second class came with fewer amenities, as well as smaller and more basic spaces. It was more average than anything, but it was still nice and comfortable and gave passengers plenty of options for places to hang out. But it was the third class that made the Lusitania's owners the most money. It was popular among immigrants and was known for having nicer and more spacious third-class accommodations than other transatlantic ocean liners at the time. When World War I broke out in 1914, many passenger vessels went out of service due to safety concerns. The Lusitania received a drab gray paint job to make her less noticeable and conceal her identity, and continued to operate commercially even as concerns rose about the growing threat of German submarines. On May 7, 1915, the ship was struck by a torpedo just 11 miles off the Irish coast. She was nearing the end of her 202nd crossing when she began to run aground and list from the damage. Just 18 minutes after being hit, the Lusitania slipped beneath the waves. This resulted in the deaths of nearly 1,200 of the 1,962 passengers and crew members aboard the vessel. Many of the survivors were praised for springing into action to help save others. Irish rescuers who responded to the ship's distress call were also commended for their bravery. German officials defended the decision to sink a passenger ship and claimed no responsibility for the lives that were lost. But the attack sparked widespread outrage among civilians in several countries, especially Britain and the US. This incident brought America one step closer to getting involved in the war. Would you rather travel by boat or by plane? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 4, the USS Constitution. The 204-foot-long USS Constitution, named Old Ironsides, was a three-masted wooden warship known as a frigate. It was built in Boston, Massachusetts during the 1790s for the United States Navy, and it was one of 6 original frigates that Congress approved the construction of after America won its independence from Britain. As one of the designated capital vessels of the young country's Navy, the Constitution and its sister ships were larger and more heavily armed than standard frigates of the time. Upon entering service in 1797, the Constitution's first assignment was to protect merchant ships from the French during an unofficial naval conflict known as the Quasi-War. The vessel was also tasked with defeating Barbary pirates in the First Barbary War. However, the ship is best remembered for its service during the War of 1812 against Great Britain. Throughout the conflict, the Constitution defeated 4 British warships and captured numerous merchant vessels. Over the following decades, the ship traveled all over the world, carrying out various assignments for the Navy. During the American Civil War, the U.S. Naval Academy used the Constitution as a training ship. Her more than 80-year career came to an end in 1881 when she was retired from service. In 1907, the Constitution was designated as a museum ship, and then in 1934 she embarked on a 3-year-long nationwide tour, stopping at 90 ports along the way. It's surprising that the Constitution was still intact on her 200th birthday in 1997. Then, in 2012, the ship sailed under her own power to mark the anniversary of her victory against the French Navy ship, the HMS Guerrière. Today, the vessel continues to operate as a museum under the direction of active-duty naval officers and crew. The Constitution is currently the oldest ship in the world that's still afloat. Number 3. The Santa Maria. The 77-foot-long Santa Maria was the largest of the 3 ships that Christopher Columbus commanded on his famed expedition to North America in 1492. Columbus obtained the vessel after convincing its owner and captain, Castilian mapmaker Juan de la Cosa, to assist with his journeys to the so-called New World. Some historians believe that Columbus couldn't have carried out his missions without de la Cosa's help. But in an unsurprising display of the shameless arrogance that Columbus remains notorious for to this day, the explorer's diaries lack any mention of due credit to de la Cosa for his sponsorship. The men ran the Santa Maria together as the flagship of the flotilla, sailing alongside Columbus's smaller ships, the Niña and the Pinta. The 2 men learned during the journey that they didn't like each other very much, and they disagreed on which one of them had the rightful command over the Santa Maria. As the ship's admiral, Columbus was technically in charge. However, he still found ways to overstep boundaries, and his crew was also disobedient. De la Cosa, on the other hand, believed that as the vessel's captain, he deserved more decision-making power than he was given. But when an inexperienced crew member ran the Santa Maria aground off the coast of what is now Haiti on Christmas Day, they no longer had a ship to fight over. Columbus wanted to try salvaging the ship, but de la Cosa refused to cooperate and sought refuge on the Niña. Acting under Columbus's orders, the crew dismantled the vessel and used the timber to construct a fort along the island's coast called Villa de la Navidad. 3 weeks after constructing the fort, Columbus headed back to Spain aboard the Niña and left 39 sailors at the site of Villa de la Navidad. But when he returned the next year, all of the inhabitants of the fort were nowhere to be found. Historical records suggest that the settlement was destroyed at some point, and modern experts are still searching to find any trace of it. Number 2, the USS New Jersey. The USS New Jersey was built in the 1940s as an Iowa-class battleship for the U.S. Navy. These formidable war machines were designed to intercept the fastest enemy warships and to act as a fast wing in traditional battle alongside slower naval ships. Unlike most of the Navy's other vessels, they were capable of keeping up with aircraft carriers and operating ahead of the rest of the fleet. As the Navy's first vessels that were specifically engineered for speed, the 880-foot-long New Jersey and its sister ships were the fastest battleships ever built. Each vessel was powered by 8 boilers and 4 steam turbines, giving it the strength that it needed to maintain a high speed over long distances. The Iowa-class vessels were decommissioned and mothballed during the 1950s. In 1968, the New Jersey came out of retirement to serve in the Vietnam War. During a shakedown cruise to test its performance before going overseas, Captain J. Edward Snyder pushed the engines to their limits. The ship topped out at 40 miles per hour and maintained this speed for 6 hours. When Captain Snyder ordered the crew to hit the brakes full force, the ship continued to move for 2 miles before stopping. Due to their historic value, all 4 Iowa-class ships were restored, and most of them were turned into museum ships throughout the U.S. The New Jersey was donated to the Home Port Alliance in Camden and was converted into a museum ship in October of 2001, where it remains to this day. Number 1. The HMS Victory. The English-built warship, the HMS Victory, served under dozens of captains and admirals throughout her decades-long career with the Royal Navy. She first saw combat in 1778 during an encounter with the French in the English Channel, known as the First Battle of Ushant. 2 years later, the Victory helped intercept a French naval fleet off the coast of Brittany in the Second Battle of Ushant. In 1782, the vessel guided a merchant convoy into Gibraltar in order to replenish their supplies in the event of a French and Spanish military blockade. Luckily, they didn't encounter any resistance upon entering the straits, and they successfully unloaded the supplies. Then in 1797, she fought against the Spanish in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, followed by the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, which both ended with British victories. The Victory was heavily damaged at Trafalgar, and she spent the next several decades serving as a troop ship, a floating depot, a prison ship, and a school. Public campaigns saved the ship from being dismantled and ultimately led to her restoration as a museum. After more than 244 years of service, she's the world's oldest naval vessel still in commission as of 2022. Which of these famous ships was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.